The first rule most people are taught about money is also the rule that keeps most people from ever having much of it. They are taught to follow the path. Study hard, get the grades, get the job, do what you are told, keep your head down, save a little, retire late, and hope that obedience will eventually be mistaken for ownership. I have watched that script for a very long time. It produces decent employees, it produces reliable taxpayers, it produces people who know how to endure. What it rarely produces is unusual wealth. That is not because work is worthless, it is because the path most people are given is designed around stability for the system, not freedom for the person inside it. That is the first thing I want you to understand. If you want to get rich, you usually do not begin by becoming more obedient to the script. You begin by understanding what the script is for. Once you see that clearly, you stop asking the childish question, which is whether the script is fair. You begin asking the adult question, which is whether following it leads where you think it leads. That is a very different question. And if you are honest about the answer, it changes your whole life. Most people hear a title like this and think the argument must be reckless. They imagine rule, breaking in the shallow sense, lawlessness, cheating, fraud, some theatrical rebellion against society. That is not what I mean. I am not interested in criminality. Crime is usually a low-class imitation of strategy. It is noisy, crude, and often ends with a man losing the one thing he still owned, which is his freedom. That is not wealth building. That is destruction with adrenaline. What I mean is something much colder. The rules that keep ordinary people average are very often not laws at all. They are scripts, cultural instructions, social expectations, career defaults, money habits dressed up as morality. And those scripts are powerful precisely because they feel respectable. The system does not need to chain people physically when it can hand them a script that sounds responsible enough to become a cage they maintain themselves. That is how most people stay poor without ever feeling openly oppressed. They cooperate. They do it with clean consciences. They believe the game is built to reward the very behavior that the game actually requires from them in order to keep functioning. That is why I say becoming rich often requires breaking their rules. Not the laws that protect you, the scripts that shrink you. That distinction matters, because if you cannot tell the difference, then every conventional life decision begins looking moral, when many of them are simply useful to someone else. I want to give you the cleaner version. There are worker rules and there are wealth rules. Worker rules are about predictability. Wealth rules are about leverage. Worker rules say prove you can follow instructions. Wealth rules say build a position where instructions matter less. Worker rules say trade time for. Wealth rules say own things that pay you whether you are present or not. Worker rules say avoid visible risk. Wealth rules say understand risk well enough to take the right kind. Worker rules say stay legible to authority. Wealth rules say build enough margin that authority is no longer the center of your life. That is the conflict. Most people spend their prime years mastering one rule set and then wonder why it does not magically produce the results associated with the other. Now, let me say something that makes many people uncomfortable. Hard work is not the secret of getting rich. Hard work is often the entry ticket to becoming employable. That is not the same thing. A person can work 80 hours a week and still be poor if he is working inside a structure where effort is rented out cheaply and ownership lies elsewhere. The market does not pay merely for exhaustion. It pays for scarce value, control, scale, timing, and ownership. That is why the hardest working people in many societies are often nowhere near the richest. The nurse working overtime, the roofer in the summer, the warehouse worker on the night shift, the immigrant running from job to job, the single mother holding together 3 part-time roles while managing a household that never quite gets to breathe. Tell me again that hard work alone explains wealth. It does not. It explains fatigue very well. Wealth is a different problem. Wealth asks who owns the machine, not who sweats next to it. That is why rule followers get confused. They were taught that diligence and obedience naturally rise into prosperity. Those traits are useful, yes, but they are not sufficient. they often become fuel for someone else's balance sheet. If you never cross into ownership, that is the key word, ownership. Not activity, not even excellence alone. Ownership, this is why I always come back to the same question when I look at a life. Is this person building something he owns, or is he becoming extremely proficient at serving something someone else owns? That question tells you more than most arfe sumfes ever will. Now, this is where the conversation usually goes wrong. People hear ownership and immediately reduce it to glamour. Start a startup, become a founder, make $1 million in your garage, fine sometimes. But ownership is broader than that and more practical than that. You can own equity in a good business. You can own a rental asset with sane financing. You can own a small private company that throws off ordinary but dependable cash flow. You can own intellectual property. You can own distribution. You can own a valuable niche where the customer returns, because the alternatives are weak. You can own a stake in the output of the economy instead of only selling your labor into it. That is the real dividing line. A worker sells hours. An owner accumulates claims. That is why I say the first real rule you must break is the rule that says being good at the system's tasks is the same thing as becoming free from the system. It is not. Being good at the system's tasks often just makes you more useful to the system, sometimes very well paid, still not free. That is an important distinction. A highly paid employee with no ownership, high fixed costs, lifestyle, and dependence on one employer may look rich from the outside and still be structurally fragile. A less flashy person with lower burn, a few productive assets, and the patience to keep buying claims on future cash flow may look ordinary from the outside and be much closer to real wealth. That is why appearances mislead so badly in money. The public sees income and thinks success. I look at ownership and think freedom. Those are not the same measurement. Now let me go deeper. The reason worker rules are so effective is that they are taught early enough to feel like reality itself. Get good grades, respect authority. Do not question the path. Do not be unrealistic. A stable job is success. Debt is dangerous. Risk is for reckless people. Asking for too much is arrogance. Promotion is the right kind of ambition. All of those things sound sensible until you ask a more dangerous question: who benefits most if everyone believes them? That is where the script starts becoming visible. Good grades are not bad, but in many settings they are valued mainly because they signal that you can absorb a system's demands, follow instructions, hit deadlines, and behave in an orderly way under evaluation. That is useful. It makes you employable. It does not automatically make you wealthy. A stable job is not bad. Stability has value, but the way stability is marketed to ordinary people often hides the fact that stability inside a hierarchy also means dependency on the hierarchy's decisions. You can be terminated, outsourced, reorganized, replaced. Your pension can change, your bonus can change, your title can change. The business can decide your role no longer belongs in the future. It is building. That is not stability in any deep sense. That is rent paid in wages. Useful? Yes. Permanent? No. This is why I dislike lazy language around job security. The public is taught to fear entrepreneurial risk, but rarely taught to examine employment risk with the same honesty. A person with one employer, one salary stream, no meaningful liquid reserves, and no productive assets is not living a low-risk life. He is living a concentrated risk life that has been socially normalized. That is different. And because it is normalized, people do not price it correctly. That is how the script works. It takes a form of exposure and makes it feel like prudence. Then it takes a form of calculated ownership, building, and makes it feel like recklessness. That is how a hierarchy gets defended without ever having to call itself a hierarchy. Now let me talk about debt, because this is one of the clearest examples of how poor rules and rich rules can use the same tool and create opposite destinies. The public is taught that debt is bad. That advice is useful enough for a lot of ordinary life that people stop examining it more deeply. Consumer debt for pointless consumption is often destructive. A credit card used to fake a lifestyle is poison. A car loan that swallows your margin is poison. A payday loan is a kind of engineered humiliation. Fine, all true. But the conclusion many people then draw is far too broad. They conclude that debt itself is the enemy. No stupid debt is the enemy. Debt used to consume is one thing. Debt used to acquire a productive asset is another thing entirely. That distinction is one of the great dividing lines in wealth building. A person who borrows to buy a depreciating symbol of status is shrinking future freedom to flatter present ego. A person who borrows on sane terms to acquire an asset that throws off cash flow is using the balance sheet in a completely different way. That does not mean all leverage is wise. It means leverage is a tool, and tools become dangerous, mainly in the hands of people who are taught slogans instead of structure. This is another rule you must break. The rule that says all debt is the same. It is not. The debt that finances consumption keeps you obedient because it mortgages tomorrow's labor for yesterday's impulse. The debt that finances productive assets can increase your claims on the future if the numbers are honest. That is a huge difference. Most people never cross it because they were trained to treat money morally rather than strategically. They ask whether something feels responsible. They do not ask whether the cash flow works. They ask whether borrowing sounds risky. They do not ask what exactly is being bought and what that thing will do. That is why I say rich rules are not mainly about breaking rules in the childish sense. They are about refusing lazy categories, refusing to let the script tell you that all leverage is evil while the people who taught you that quietly use balance sheets to acquire property. Businesses and tax advantages, that is not morality. That is asymmetry. Now let me say something about risk, because the poor are taught to fear it while the rich are taught to structure it. That difference alone explains more than people want to admit. Poor advice says avoid risk. Rich advice says understand it. Those are not the same sentence. Everything meaningful in economic life has risk. Employment has risk. Entrepreneurship has risk. Investment has risk. Not choosing has risk. Staying in one city has risk. Leaving your city has risk. Going to college has risk. Skipping college has risk. There is no risk. Free adult life. That is a fantasy created for people who need the comfort of certainty more than the truth. The real question is never whether risk exists. The real question is what kind of risk you are taking and what kind of upside or downside sits on the other side of it. The poor are often told to avoid risk because they do not have enough buffer to survive a mistake. That part is rational. But if all you ever do is avoid visible risk, you often become trapped inside invisible risk. You keep the stable job while one company controls your livelihood. You avoid investing while inflation silently attacks your savings. You avoid starting anything while age, obligation, and fatigue reduce your future optionality. You avoid discomfort until comfort itself becomes your cage. That is what the script never admits. It sells caution as safety, even when the caution is gradually locking you into a narrower and narrower life. This is why I think one of the deepest secrets of getting rich is not boldness alone, but risk capacity. Can you survive a wrong move? Can you absorb embarrassment? Can you endure a period where the outside world thinks you made a mistake? Can you keep acting if success takes longer than the people around you think is reasonable? That is real power. And if you do not come from money, building that power is part of your job. That means liquidity. That means lower fixed costs. That means a life with enough margin that one failed experiment does not become a funeral. That means reducing the forms of debt that make you fragile. That means not allowing your lifestyle to become so beautiful that it makes you strategically weak. I have seen too many people with high incomes and no options. I have seen too many people with moderate incomes but clear margin who could actually move when opportunity appeared. Margin is wealth before wealth becomes visible. That is another rule worth breaking. The rule that says the point of earning more is mainly to look richer. No, the point of earning more is to widen your room for strategic action. If more income only produces more consumption, then you have not increased freedom. You have increased decoration. Decoration is not useless. It is just a poor substitute for leverage over your own life. Now, let me turn to something subtler: permission. This may be the most dangerous rule of all. Most people are trained to ask for permission from systems that have no intention of making them free. Permission to start, permission to try, permission to speak, permission to charge more, permission to leave, permission to say no, permission to become visible, permission to look ambitious, permission to choose a path that the local community does not understand. I have very little patience for permission as a life strategy. Not because authority never matters, of course it matters, but because opportunities decay while permission is being processed. The world rewards timely movement more than polite waiting in many fields. The person who waits for everyone around him to agree that the move makes sense is usually arriving after the asymmetry is gone. That is why wealth often belongs to people willing to be misunderstood for a while. I am not talking about crime or fraud. I am talking about social disapproval, the raised eyebrow, the family tension, the friend who says you changed, the boss who prefers you grateful and compliant, the peers who liked you best when your ambitions still fit their emotional budget. If you cannot survive that kind of discomfort, wealth gets much harder, because the path to wealth often looks impractical right before it starts looking wise. That is another thing the rich understand better than the poor. If you were raised in a world where authority is negotiable, where family sees experimentation as development rather than rebellion, where a failed attempt does not destroy your reputation forever, then unconventional moves feel much less dangerous. If you were raised in a world where obedience protected you and deviation invited punishment, then unconventional moves feel existential. That does not mean you are weak. It means the system trained you well for one game. Now you have to decide whether that game is the one that can actually make you free. That is not an easy transition. It is still necessary. Now let me say something about abundance, because this term is usually abused by fools. I do not mean magical thinking. I do not mean pretending resources are infinite. I mean something more concrete. The poor are often trained into a zero-sum emotional world long before they ever hear the phrase. If someone else wins, that must mean less room for me. If someone else is promoted, that must mean I was denied. If someone else builds something, I should resent it, because the pie is fixed. This mindset is understandable in rigid systems. It is also one of the fastest ways to miss wealth. Why? Because wealth often appears through cooperation, adjacency, and second-order benefit. The person who has an abundance mindset in the serious sense is not denying scarcity. He is looking for where value can be created, multiplied, shared, or joined, instead of only fought over. That changes everything. Instead of asking only, "How do I get a bigger slice?" he asks, "What am I positioned to build, attach to, distribute, or amplify that grows the whole pie and gives me ownership in the growth?" That is much closer to how wealth actually behaves. Wealth is not always won in direct combat. Very often it is won by owning the platform, the toll booth, the infrastructure, the distribution, the software layer, the boring service everyone keeps needing while they argue about the glamorous thing on top of it. That is why the worker rule, compete for better wages, and the wealth rule, seek ownership of scalable value, lead to such different outcomes. One is linear, the other can become exponential. Now, let me address the social side of rule breaking, because this is where many people collapse before the money part even starts. The system protects itself not only with laws, but with shame. You will be told that conventional is safe, that asking hard questions is arrogance, that wanting more ownership is greed, that promoting yourself is vulgar, that being strategic is manipulative, that staying in the job everyone understands is maturity, that wanting unusual wealth is vanity. The system loves these phrases because they make the ambitious person police himself, and self-policing is always cheaper than external enforcement. So if you want to get rich, one rule you often must break is the rule that social approval is evidence of correct direction. Sometimes it is. Often it is not. Many communities praise the behavior that preserves coherence inside the group, not the behavior that maximizes the individual's upside. That is why so many people never leave the local equilibrium. They do not want to pay the emotional cost of being thought strange. Again, I am not telling you to become antisocial. I am telling you that approval and wealth often separate before wealth and approval reunite later. That is an important sequence to understand. First, they think you are odd, then risky, then selfish, then lucky, then smart. That is usually the order. Most people cannot survive the middle phases. That is why they never reach the last one. Now, if everything I have said so far sounds cold, good money is colder than people like admitting. That is why sentimental stories about fairness, hustle, and patience often leave the deepest structures untouched. Wealth does not care whether your intentions were pure. It cares whether you built ownership, margin, leverage, and useful exposure to luck. Luck is the last thing I want to discuss because people misuse it in two opposite ways. Some people use luck as an excuse for total passivity. If luck matters, why try? Other people deny luck because admitting it threatens the flattering story they tell about their own success. Both groups misunderstand it. Luck is not the whole game. Luck is part of the game, and the serious question is not whether luck matters. It obviously does. The serious question is what you can do to make luck more likely to intersect with your life in useful form. That is where strategy begins. You choose a field where upside exists. You move to a place where effort has higher return. You put yourself near capital talent and serious standards. You build a skill stack that becomes valuable in multiple contexts. You reduce your burn so you can say yes when the right opening arrives. You build relationships that expand your access to rooms you were not born into. You become visible to the right people. You stay in motion long enough that random opportunity can actually hit something prepared. That is what strategic luck looks like, not a miracle. Positioning. And once you understand that, the whole self-made myth begins to look childish. Nobody serious is fully self-made. The truth is always more textured. Someone had more cushion, more access, better timing, a stronger network, a better passport, a better school, a parent who understood a certain game, a city with more doors, a chance encounter that became a career, a market cycle that rewarded a specific move. Luck, it is all luck, structure, and behavior braided together. The point is not to cry about that. The point is to use it. If you know success depends partly on luck, then you should stop worshiping routines in isolation and start building life architecture that makes luck more likely to matter when it appears. That is a much more adult way to think. Now let me make this practical. If I were giving advice to a young person with no inherited wealth and no elite cushion, I would say 3 things. First, stop expecting the standard script to make you rich. It may make you employable. It may make you respectable. It may even make you comfortable if you are lucky and disciplined enough. But comfort is not the same thing as wealth, and respectability is not the same thing as freedom. Second, build margin before you build image. Lower your burn, kill stupid debt, keep cash. Learn something difficult enough that people pay for it. Do not let appearances strip you of mobility. Do not buy the costume of success at the cost of the substance. Third, move toward better games, better city, better field, better network, better rooms, better collisions, better opportunities for useful luck. It may mean disappointing people who preferred your obedience. It may mean taking a path that looks stranger than the conventional path. Fine. Wealth has always belonged disproportionately to people willing to change games instead of merely behaving better inside bad ones. That is the real secret. Not intensity without direction that compounds. Now I want to say one last thing because it matters. Breaking their rules is not a guarantee of wealth. There are no guarantees. You can choose well and still suffer bad timing. You can take a calculated risk and still lose. You can move to a better arena and still spend years paying entrance tuition. You can do almost everything right and still miss some giant outcome because luck did not show up in the exact form you wanted. That is life. But the alternative is not safety. The alternative is to stay obedient inside a structure that was never designed to produce unusual wealth for people like you in the first place. That is a worse gamble. At least the strategic path gives you a real shot. The obedient path often gives you a very polished cage. That is the difference. So here is the final choice. You can keep following the worker script, collecting approval from systems that profit from your compliance, and hope that discipline alone will someday be mistaken for ownership. Many people will do exactly that, or you can do the harder thing. You can distinguish laws from scripts. You can break the scripts that keep you average. You can stop confusing employment with wealth. You can learn the difference between stupid debt and productive debt. You can build enough margin to survive useful risks. You can act before the room fully agrees with you. You can put yourself where luck is more likely to collide with preparation, and you can begin living by the rules that create ownership instead of merely protecting obedience. That is how people really get rich, not by becoming better servants of the old game, by learning which parts of the game were written for them, which parts were written against them, and which parts they can quietly step outside long enough to build something that belongs to them. That is the real shot at wealth. And for most people, it does not begin with following the rules more faithfully. It begins with asking who those rules were built to enrich in the first place.